Well, welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives, and got some interesting topics to talk about this week. We're going to start off with a lighthearted, or at least not depressing story. We'll get to those later. But this is a story about water on Mars. And joining us this week are, of course, Chris Ayres from England, and we're joined this week by Dr. Tony Mitchell. And I want to say welcome to both of them. And so, any reactions to the discovery of water on Mars? Chris?
I was interested. I wasn't necessarily particularly surprised. Of course, the obvious follow-on from that is if there is water there, it massively increases the possibility of there being life there, which we don't know about at present. Life there would be interesting.
Yes, it would. Tony?
Well, I agree with Chris. If there's water, it's the age-old question: how do we know if there's life, and what is the signs of life? So we test for water.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we came on camera, we were talking about Star Trek and life on other planets, and I've always thought maybe there's a different set of operating rules for other life forms.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're talking about carbon-based life forms that follow the basic laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, we have to have water.
Yep.
And then you get into your operating parameters of temperatures, temperate zone, because it has to be water at a liquid phase.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's water on Mars, there's more experiments. One of the things I always told my students was every time you answer the answer to one question is two more questions.
That's how we oftentimes we learn. I actually think that I'm not surprised that there's water. I mean, they've pretty much have seen evidence of that in the past. So the question was, there would be flowing water. Actually, more technically, did they have flowing water there? Because they've known they had water. But I do think it raises some interesting possibilities. As for life, I'm all for the search. I'm very, very skeptical that they will find life elsewhere in the universe. Just simply because Carl Sagan's famous calculation of billions and billions of planets only took into account 4 factors. There's actually, when I wrote my book, there were 30, and at that time, the odds of there being a planet that could support life was less than 1 in 100. And since then, they've added another 10 to 15 parameters, so it's probably even less than that now. So and that's just having a planet available for life that would, or at least intelligent life, that would get going. I mean, you still have the issue of even getting life started, which is, by all real definitions, a miracle, even in the scientific realm. It's so the idea that we'd find life actually on Mars, I think, is fairly remote, but still think it's interesting to do the search and interesting to see what they come up with.
I was going to say,
here's a question for you. How would the discovery of life, both just life in general, or even more specific, intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, affect our view as Christians?
well, that's the first thing you got to do is by life. Are we talking about just microbes, or are we going to talk about life forms? I can't always get the word sentient beings, thinking, intelligent beings.
Yeah.
They're. We were having a discussion the other day. How did life come to the Earth? And of course, there's always the popular theory that we're the product of an alien life experiment, biology experiment.
Yes.
What is it? My guess is that if we found other intelligent beings, we would have to do the same thing that happened when we shifted from the geocentric solar system to the heliocentric solar system. We'd have to alter, we wouldn't be altering our view of God as Christians, but we would be altering our view of our place in the world.
Yep. Chris?
I agree. I'm probably more optimistic than you are, Elgin, about the prospect of the being a life which has evolved somewhere else. Yes, I appreciate that there are an awful lot of parameters you can feed into this, and it can appear exceptionally unlikely that there would ever be life anywhere. But if I look at probabilities, I can show that it's immensely improbable that I will stub my toe against a dog toy somewhere downstairs. But nevertheless, every so often that does happen because we have dogs. What it'd do to my faith is pretty much nothing. Yes, you can say, well, the revelation happened here, Christ came here, but I just widen the perspective slightly. I don't think it any more peculiar, particularly that Christ would come to Earth among perhaps 1 million places where there is intelligent life, than that he came to first century Palestine, which is an incredibly specific and local place for things to happen. And a lot of what we have in the Bible flows from that specific locality.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to speculate, but then again, like I said, I am skeptical that we will find life elsewhere, but if we do, whether it affects my faith or not actually depends a heck of a lot on what they say when we find them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's easy to assume a Star Trek or Star Wars universe where they know nothing about Jesus Christ or the God that we know of. But on the other hand, what if they come and they basically have the same belief? You can speculate anything, and that's kind of where we're at on that. So.
Well, we're always reminded that until such time as warp drive becomes a physical possibility, there's always the light year time zone. That is, if there is intelligent life in the universe elsewhere, they see our society in terms of I Love Lucy, Father Knows Best, and all the good 50s TV shows. And they probably stay in a way.
Well, I'd rather them look at the 50s and 60s TV shows than maybe some of the more modern ones. But I mean, what if they judged us by MTV?
They'll stay away.
Definitely.
All right. Well, from that kind of fun, lighthearted topic, we move to something a bit more depressing. There was another school shooting, this one in Oregon. I've heard reports vary. Somewhere around 10 people were killed, including the gunman. And, of course, it raises the issue of, is there anything that can be done about this? Is this just something I know the president immediately came out, was calling for more gun control. Is there anything that we can actually do about this? Or is it just a tragedy we have to accept?
Well, if we accept it, it's a tragedy. And if we just accept it, then we're going to say that the next one's not going to mean anything. And we have to get into a serious discussion of our culture. Our colleague Alan Bevere put a piece up questioning whether we're accepting violence as a way of life. And I think what my comment on his Facebook page was, we see violence as the answer. Any problem that we have, the answer is violence. And my other comment that I posted was, look at the numbers we spend on in America. I assume the numbers are probably similar in England. Military budgets, security budgets, and then going back to Star Trek, Star Wars. We're not doing anything in outer space right now. Yeah. There is a presence, but it's not us. And the numbers are so out of whack. If we flip the numbers and spend all the money on military and security and put that into science and humanitarian efforts, what would happen to the world?
We spend a much smaller proportion of our GDP on the military than you do.
That's because we spend it all.
That might be part of the answer, yes.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we don't tend to see many people these days who are obvious candidates for invading us in a hurry. Not since the European Union started, which nicely incorporates all of our historical opponents, more or less all of our historical opponents. I think you could do an awful lot in terms of gun control. You have very little gun control. We had school shootings in 1987 and then in 1996, after both of which we increased gun control massively, to the extent that really very, very few people can legally own weapons except for hunting purposes. Handguns largely don't exist outside gun clubs and law enforcement, for instance. Whether that has actually reduced the possibility is an interesting question, but what it has definitely done is massively reduced the number of accidental shootings and the number of people committing suicide using firearms. And that's a good in and of itself. I don't really accept the principle that you have a different culture and it would never fly, because I am seeing figures for approval in the States for more gun control which are looking as if they might become a majority. Now, at one point, I never thought that a ban on smoking in public places was a possibility in this country, due to the vast number of people who did it. But it got introduced, and it is being observed. I thought even less that it would work in France, but it's worked there as well. So attitudes can be changed, and part of the change in attitudes is legislation. But that isn't all of the change in attitudes. And yes, less concentration on violence. Less concentration on violence as a way of resolving a problem in particular. Yeah. And one of the meanings I see in the death and resurrection of Christ is that points up the utter fatuity of violence as a means of resolving problems. It condemns it. Violence is not redemptive. Violence is just violence and to be avoided at all costs.
Well, I'm not too surprisingly, I take a somewhat different view. I, as for one thing, I see I'm not sure what the polls you're looking at, but I know one of the things that seems to be going on is actually we're seeing an increase in guns in this country. So the idea that gun control is part of it is, I think, comes down to what do you mean by gun control. I think pretty much everybody, even for example, even the NRA, which is probably one of the staunchest defenders of gun rights, is for various forms of gun control in terms of keeping guns out of the hands of the mentally ill and things like that. I think one of the problems is blurring the lines, but I find an interesting concept here, an interesting difference between the sides is whereas I agree, part of our problem is culture. You look at TV or movies or the gangster idea where we in our society we lift up gangsters and we not just the 30s but even going a lot of rap music and stuff is centered around a gangster type mentality. A lot of rap music people have been killed in gun battles. So there's this glorification of violence and a decrease of moral standards is more to me more of the problem than the things, i.e. guns. I honestly believe, and I wrote this in one of my books, I think one of the big problems is there's a reason that when these people decide that they want to go kill a bunch of people, they go to a school, or they go to a mall, or they go someplace else that they know is proudly proclaimed as a gun-free zone. Because once that guy got onto the campus and started shooting, the only thing that was going to realistically stop him is when he decided to give up and leave, or a law enforcement officer or somebody else having a gun put a stop to him, which is what happened in this case. So I think they go to these places because they know it's a safe place to shoot people because nobody there will have a gun because they're not allowed. Of course, that doesn't stop the killer, but it does make it easier for them to carry out their evil deeds.
The thing there is that in 2 of the 3 instances I can remember of a lot of people being killed by a gunman here involved schools. And it can't there have been a choice of, a school is the place where there won't be any guns, because there wouldn't be any guns virtually anywhere in this country. Even back in 1987 with the Hungerford shooter, who was partially in a school and partially out in the community. Schools provide you, if you have that mentality, with a massive collection of easy targets.
Yeah.
Also, quite a lot of the time, you do find that people whose mentalities are not entirely as they might be have issues about schools stemming from their own schooling. So I think that has something to do with it. However, yes, I have seen figures that indicate that if you have an area in the States with heavy gun control and an area without heavy gun control, things leak over the boundaries, shall we say. So probably somebody is going to go to there for preference to somewhere close where there isn't likely to be the same preponderance of guns. The thing is, I do not see any evidence in the States that privately owned guns have been of much use in preventing other gun crime. In the hands of the police, yes, but not in the hands of private individuals. If anything, produces.
I think part of that is that they don't get reported. I know, there was a case. Unfortunately, it's anecdotal because of the lack of. But there was an instance in Florida where a Vietnamese man was walking through one of these bizarre fair type things, and what you would probably term a redneck was giving him a lot of hassle and pulled a knife on him. And the Vietnamese guy just lifted up his shirt, showed him his gun. He had a permit to carry a gun. Just lifted up his shirt, showed him his gun, and the guy with the knife ran off. And they reported it, and the guy with the knife was later arrested. So, yeah, something like that's not going to make the news really big because nothing happened, per se. Had the guy not had a gun, it could have been a lot worse. By the way, the largest school death situation occurred in the United States back in the 1930s, and it was a bomb. A guy blew up the school and killed, I think, somewhere like 30 to 40 children. So, evil will find a way to commit evil, which I think is, to me, more of a problem than the prevalence or lack thereof of firearms.
It was an interesting report. A couple things. The idea that the campus, the Oregon campus, was a gun-free zone. There was a residential area next to it. So this goes back to something Chris said, where there's a blending of the area. And there was a report of at least one individual who did have a Glock on his possession, but he chose not to do anything. And his argument was, if I was out there with my gun trying to stop this shooter, the police and the other law enforcement wouldn't be able to determine who the good guy was and who the bad guy was.
Yep.
And which, and he said, they're coming in, they're prepared, I'm going to stay out of it. Which kind of, the argument that comes about a lot of times is that if everybody had a gun, this wouldn't occur. Well, I can see in some situations where if everybody's got a gun, there's going to be a lot. How are you going to sort out who the good guy is and who the bad guy is?
Yeah. The one other aspect of the story I'd like to get before we completely run out of time is now early reports are oftentimes wrong, but based on the early reports, this guy was singling out Christians, and we oftentimes hear, for example, when the congressman in California or in Arizona was shot, there's all this hand-wringing about, was he led to do it because, for example, Sarah Palin had a commercial about targeting certain congressional districts, and did that language inspire this person? And this is a situation where I think it's very common in the media. Christians are pretty much open season, to use a bad term, but they are routinely criticized. And is that part of something we should be more concerned about?
No. The individual, what I read was the individual had a problem with organized religion.
Yeah.
It just happened that he chose Christianity. I can think of a few years back, 40-some years ago, I had a problem with organized religion. The way they presented themselves, and this is speculation on my part as to what this young man's, why he had the problem. But I know that when I was 15, 16 years old, I had a problem with organized religion, especially the fundamentalist approach to how you became a Christian. And it was enough to drive me, it wasn't enough to make me hate them, but it was enough to make me think this isn't what I wanted to do. Now, I went a different route. And I never left the church, but there were times when just the approach of a fundamentalist was enough to make me go away. And like I said, I'm not totally sure. I know all they've reported is he had a problem with organized religion, and that's why he went in. He lumped everybody in one group and decided those are the people that hate me the most. They're the ones that I'm going to eliminate.
Chris?
It's also by far most likely that he has experience of Christians as a group. I know an awful lot of enthusiastic atheists I know will target Christians for preference because that's the background they came from, and that's the set of people who gave them major problems when they were initially finding out that they were atheists for being atheists. So I think it's more a function of the fact that the States is preponderantly Christian than that it is that Christians are particularly hated. Yes, there is flack in the news. There's also an awful lot of Christian speak in parts of the American news media. I don't get either side of that in the UK, where Christianity is mostly ignored as being more or less irrelevant to general life, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, I think that's maybe why Christ said he preferred you hot or cold, but not lukewarm. So. Yeah, I actually agree. I mean, to me, the person to blame is the person who did this. If I'm going to target anything in the media per se, it would be its glorification of violence in the sense that it makes this seem legitimate. For example, in my book, Preserving Democracy, I have the incident of the shooting of the mall in Oklahoma City, and the comment of a friend of the killer who said that he just wanted to go out in style, and this was his way of going out in style. Didn't think anything less of him, but just, that was just his way of going out in style. And that type of attitude is something that, that should not be something that the media glorifies. The other thing is, I deplore, and I'm glad we have not here, I deplore the in-depth focus into the killer themselves. I notice we have not used his name, and I'm glad, and I won't use his name. As far as I'd like to see it, I'd like to see the media focus on the victims, the lives that were lost, heroes, if there are any, that what they did to save lives. And as far as I'm concerned, the killer can drop off into oblivion and never be heard from. I would be quite happy if that was the focus of the media, and I think that would probably do a lot to diminish these in the future, rather than this is the way to get your 15 minutes of fame. Any closing comments before the bottom of the hour?
Yeah.
We just need to, I think we need to, like you said, the sheriff in Douglas County's refused to mention the shooter's name, and that's it. We need to shift to the people who protected people. I saw a report on that, and to go back to what I said earlier, we need to be making a more forceful effort to move towards the positive of life, towards the exploration of planets, discovery of life.
Yeah.
Moving on that and moving less away from a funding for violence.
Yep. Okay, well, that brings us to the bottom of the hour, and this is take a short time to introduce everybody. Again, my name is Elgin Hushbeck, and you can see what I write at hushbeck.com. I'm also the author of 4 books, Preserving Democracy, What is Wrong with Social Justice, Evidence for the Bible, and Christianity and Secularism. And Chris?
I'm Chris Eyre. I edit for Energian, and I blog at airlines.energian.net. So that's EYRE Lines, which is a pun on my surname.
And Tony?
I'm Tony Mitchell, and I'm trying to be an author for Energin. I'm trying to be an author, period. I've actually, I hope Henry doesn't get upset, but I'm talking to another publisher. It has to do with my grandfather's diary of World War I.
Oh.
And I'm in talk with my college, Truman State University, as the publisher, because it's a Missouri diet. My grandfather was raised in Missouri. I went to school in Missouri. It's very interesting because right now I'm scanning photos that he collected. Going back to what we said earlier, these are postcards from World War I, in which there's scenes of death and destruction.
Yeah.
I don't understand that. They weren't photos he took; they were photos he apparently bought because they were commercially made. But it's a very interesting. This is a way I'm getting to know a gentleman. I was 5 years old when my grandfather died, so this is how I'm getting to know my grandfather. His comments about the war and in the 30s. So it's not my primary goal. Henry's book is still my primary goal. But it's what I've been sitting on this one, and now I've got to get it moved on. And so I'm working on 2 books.
Yeah. And Henry Neufeld, who's the publisher of Energeon. So, okay, well, moving into the second half, one of the stories that got pushed to the side because of the school shooting in Oregon was a story out of Germany about a reporter who had gone into ISIS, and he was reporting, based on his findings there, that they're planning on killing several 100 million people in what they term as a nuclear tsunami. And, of course, they're looking at other ways, biotech ways, and essentially however to kill people. And part of that is that there's a segment of Islam that is not only apocalyptic, but whereas Christians may look for the second coming of Christ, we don't feel, for at least the vast majority of them, that we can do anything to bring that along. Whereas in Islam, there is a view that they can bring that along, that they will bring the apocalypse, and that will bring the end of the world. And while we're not going to spend much time on that in of itself, what the focus of this more in-depth discussion will be is the prevalence of apocalyptic thought in both Christianity and Islam, and I would argue that also within the secular world, in terms of, I think this is a major part of global warming and the idea that we're going to destroy the world. Somehow there's something about human nature that that appeals to the apocalyptic, that looks for the end. That things have never been this bad, is the way it's often displayed. Well, although when you look at history, things have, quite frankly, often been quite worse. So, I mean, how many people would really want to go live back in the, quote, good old days, as opposed to the horrible days we live in now? You probably not find a whole lot of takers. So, as Christians, let's start off with how are we to approach the whole concept of end times, of the idea of is the world going to end? How are we going to deal with that? Is that something, how does that fit into a Christian theology? Chris, I know you have some unique views on that, so why don't we start with you?
From my point of view, although there is a lot of apocalyptic in the Bible, from my point of view, apocalyptic and prophecy speaks to the times it's in. Very possibly the times just in prospect, slightly beyond the horizon, but never to a longer picture. So, from my point of view, the Bible contains a fully realized eschatology. In other words, what is predicted to happen has basically happened. Or it hasn't happened because the prediction has been thrown off track in some way. I, in fact, don't think that it is possible to predict a long time in the future, because from my point of view, not even God can know the far future. All the future is possibilities, it's not actualities, and there are no actualities in existence to be known by anybody, God included.
So, just had a question here. How do you deal with the second coming of Christ? Is that something that you look forward to, that will happen, or how does that fit into your view?
I think he's been here in the shape of the church since day 3.
Okay. Tony.
Well, I was thinking something Chris said reminds me of a collection of sayings that I have, in which, in the late 19th century, they said that there would be no heart surgery, things like that. You know,
Yeah.
basically they saw, you know, the predictions are made upon what you know today.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so there's that one record executive in the 60s who turned down an opportunity to record the Beatles because he didn't think guitar music was going to work.
Yep.
I'm not sure what he's doing today. All predictions are made on what you know today. So, you know, we even, you know, the other one that jumps to mind is Bill Gates saying that 540K is good. You know, and we've got our gigabyte flash drives. The prediction of the future is going to change the moment something new comes about.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're, you know, the other side of the coin is if you're willing to accept an outcome of destruction, then you're giving up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have an, you know, I always have a hard time with the end times type mentality, saying this is what's going to happen. I'm going, not if I can help it. You know, I don't like you know, if I don't like an outcome that says I don't have an option, I don't have a say in it.
Mm-hmm.
The prophecies that speak of a doom and gloom, what can I do? You know, what can I do to change it? And do I look forward to the second coming of Christ? I think he came. I think, you know, it was. I'm not a good expert on that, but I always think that the physical return is not as critical as how well we presume to be Christ to be present in us. He may come back in a second coming. I know that's the base. I believe the second coming, if I remember correctly, the Mormon Church made that he came here to America after leaving Palestine, and that, you know, and that they offered that as an explanation for some stuff. I'd much rather have the idea that if I'm working for Christ in my life today, the second coming has occurred because he's in my life.
Well, I guess that leaves me again to be in the contrary position.
We're going to have something for you to do.
Oh, yeah.
I actually believe, to start off with a point of agreement, I agree with Chris that the vast majority of what we label prophecy, i.e. what the prophets wrote, deals with the time and situations in which the prophets lived.
Yeah.
I think that's probably most serious students of the Bible would agree with that. On the other hand, I would argue that there are books such as Revelations and Daniel that do clearly deal with the future, particularly the future from when they were written. I don't have a problem with God knowing the future, simply because that one of the things that we've learned from modern physics is that with the creation of the universe, whether you believe in a literal 7-day creation or whether you believe in the Big Bang theory of science, I tend towards the latter. But one of the things about the creation is that when matter came into existence in the Big Bang, time also came into existence. Which would mean that whatever created the universe, because I still believe in, even though I'm a supporter of the Big Bang, I still believe in creation, because something caused the Big Bang. That means whatever caused it, i.e. God, is outside of time, and therefore can see time as a variable the same way that we see X, Y, and Z as a variable. So I'm not troubled by the idea that God knows the future. So in that sense, God can predict the future, and I think when you look at, for example, Daniel, I'm just completing a study through Daniel because I'll be teaching it in the fall. There's certain passages like Daniel chapter 9 predicts that Christ will come in the year 26 A.D. Even if you accept the liberal scholars' dating of Daniel in the 2nd century, that's still pretty darn good prediction. So, to me, not only does predictive prophecy, is it a possibility, I think it's pretty much a certain reality in terms of the Bible. So, any quick comments on that before? I'd like to take this into a slightly different tone, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that, if you want to.
I have two things really. One of which is I do have in mind an apocalyptic end to all things on the earth at least. But as a result of the heat death of the sun in about 2 billion years, it isn't a subject of pressing concern to me at present. The other is that even if there is some element of prediction of the future in, for instance, Revelation, I have seen so many treatments of that apply it to different things that I am convinced that it is absolutely useless to us for the purposes of prediction.
Let me jump in real quick and say, yeah, on that we agree. And in fact, I think I'm not real big. I mean, when I was a brand new Christian after just being an atheist, I became a Christian. I became a Christian in 1979, which was when the late great planet Earth was a big fad, and I got kind of caught up in all that for a while. And I was looking for Christ to return in 1982, thereabouts, because of the time predictions. And when that didn't pan out, I began to take a little bit more serious look, and that kind of backed away from that considerably. But reading, just for example, just reading through Daniel, I don't think the purpose of Daniel, to the people he wrote it to, was to give these titillating examples of what will happen in the future. I think it was to put very clearly the idea. In fact, the subtitle of the class I'm going to be teaching is God is in control. And at the end, Daniel asks a couple of questions, and the angels basically say to him, this is for the people at that time. It's not really for you. And I don't think we will. I don't think we will know. In terms of being able to predict what will happen from Daniel. I think we can say the broad outlines of something in terms of we peek to the end of the book and we know how it's going to work out, but we don't know how it's going to get there. And I tend to view sort of a cycles type view where we will move close to that, away from that, closer to that, away from that, but we won't know when we will be there until it's sort of like, when are we going to get there? We'll get there when we get there. So, in that sense, I do kind of agree with Chris. Tony, you want to jump in here before?
Yeah, a couple things. When I'm writing about creation and whether the moment of Big Bang, I'm always the fun part is that the person who created the term the Big Bang happened to have been an atheist.
Yeah.
Fred Hoyle, the British physicist, because his comments, the reason he called that was he was afraid that what Hubble, the astronomer Edwin Hubble had discovered actually paralleled the book of Genesis, and all the atheists of the 50s got really crazy about that, and they didn't like that idea. So they were trying to work it out, which is not what we're talking about. As far as time and time stream, we're constrained by the fact that that's our beginning. The time is our beginning. Is God part of that beginning, or is he outside it? I don't know. And that doesn't bother me, whether God's outside it or not. Does God know the future? I then get into the idea of free will or destiny. If God knows the future, is he going to tell us, or is he going to let us find it out for ourselves? He gave us the skills to find it out, and that goes to the book of Revelation. I haven't read Daniel that much, though I can remember my pastor, when we were, there was 3 of us in our first Bible class, our confirmation class, and he suggested that there was that wonderful chapter of Bel and the Dragon that didn't quite make it into Daniel. Which, of course, now you've got 3 12-year-old, 13-year-old high school students trying to find the missing book in the Bible, which wasn't in the EUB church we had.
Yeah.
John, writing the book of Revelation, is writing about his fears for the moment. And those that try to move that framework into the 21st century don't understand what John was afraid of. Now, the other side of the coin, and you alluded to this somewhat, Elgin, is we all start off with that very basic fundamentalist viewpoint. But we tend to want to know more. What bothers me is the person who sees the fundamentalist viewpoint as all there is. And what happens is that they see a world that's fixed when the world is changing. And that, to me, is the greatest threat. If we're not going to see a world that's changing, we're going to have problems. And that goes back to something I said earlier. What can I do to keep the world moving in a positive forward direction and get it away from the gloom and doom Armageddon type end that so many people say is going to happen?
Well, let's take this as an opportunity to move it into a more general discussion as to what is it that leads people, be they evangelicals. I mean, I believe in the book of Revelations is at least part of it does deal with the very end times. I believe Daniel, for a lot of parts of that, deal with the end times. There's parts of Daniel that have not. Much of Daniel has already been fulfilled. There are parts that I believe have yet to be fulfilled in the last 7 years. But I don't focus on that because I have no idea when that's going to be, or like I said, that's for the people who go through that. That's not really for me. But why is it that we as people get wrapped up in the end times? The Left Behind series was immensely popular, and then outside of Christianity, you have the apocalyptic thinking in other languages, other religions, and in secular worlds, you have the whole concept of we're ending the world with global warming and stuff. What leads us to focus on things like that?
We don't push our envelope. We don't push the envelope. We don't go beyond where we're at. It's just like Gene Roddenberry creating Star Trek had the cell phone.
Yeah.
He didn't call it the communicator.
Yeah.
He was saying, okay, these are things that are going to happen. A lot of times, I think we get into a position where we don't want to push the envelope. We don't want to do new things. I'm looking. When I play grandfather and I'm working with my 7-year-old grandson on his math and his writing, I know that I've had my conversation with his instructor. They're Common Core math problems. I don't worry about them. I just teach him math and let him go from there. But so many people they see these Common Core math problems and they freak out because they don't understand them. They don't want to understand them. The fundamentalist end time. It's easier. Yeah. That's so easy to see. That and when we start talking about quantum physics and the creation and what's going on, that suddenly becomes very complicated. Because if you took physics, it took chemistry, it was a long time ago. It was a pain to get through. And all I remember about my chemistry is my instructor told terrible jokes. This is a college classmate and I. This is something that his friends and know me always point out. I remember that bad joke you told me, and that's all I remember. But they don't want to know. They want it in black and white in a world that is very colorful.
Chris?
I think I distinguish between two kinds of predictor of the end. There are the ones who are scared stiff of it and may or may not be fatalistic about it, and I have no time for the ones who are fatalistic about it because that's an excuse to do nothing now. And the ones who really scare me are the ones who actually look forward to it, which is also an excuse for not doing anything in the world as it is, but is even more scary when, going back to your comment about the Islamic fundamentalists, and I've heard certain Christian elements saying the same thing. Let's do something to bring it forward. The coming of the Mahdi, the second coming of Christ, whichever of those it is. Those people do scare me. And I am actually less scared that it'll happen at the hands of Islamic fundamentalists than I am scared that eventually the states will elect a president who thinks like that. I think what I take from this is that it lures us into looking for something in the future that we don't need to do anything about. And whereas what we want to concentrate on is what we are doing to further God's kingdom today, where we are.
Someone who's kind of on the conservative side here, this actually the idea of Christians bringing it on, if it's there, it's a very, very minority view. I don't think there's any chance the states would elect anybody like that. They'd have a hard enough time electing a mainstream evangelical, much less a radical fundamentalist. I'm not even sure how to classify a Christian who believes they can bring about the end times, because Christians are actually not a big part of the end time. So that's one of these. Most Christians believe that, which I disagree, they'll be caught up in the rapture and they won't be here. So one of the interesting things that as a conservative Christian, and try to address this one as a conservative Christian, one of the dichotomies I've always had is the idea that we're to look forward to the coming of Christ, and yet you've got to get through the end time tribulations to get there. And to me, that presents a real big dichotomy, because I'm really anxious for Christ to return, but I'm not too anxious for what's got to happen from my point of view before then. I'd like to put that off as far as possible. So how any I know this is not exactly your point of view, but any third-party suggestions, perhaps, as to how Christians can approach the end times?
Well, you got to remember, first of all, that any discussion of the rapture and the end times are the product of a 19th century writer. They're not out of Revelation. Darby, I think that's the gentleman's name, Darby. He you know, and I really enjoy his translation. He has a translation of the Bible, and I happen to enjoy it because it's easier to read. And then I found out who I was reading, and I got a little worried about that. But that's a concept. That's his concept. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Revelation. He wrote his own translation of the Bible. And those who see the end times and the rapture are merely echoing a 19th century viewpoint. I would also add to the point that if you really wanted to do that, you need to go back to the 17th century to a noted English physicist who wrote more on the end times than he did on physics. Chris, you're laughing because I think you know who I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Isaac Newton.
I know who you're talking about too.
You know, and Isaac Newton predicted in 1948 that in 1948 would be the second coming. You know, and I'm waiting for a bunch of people to suddenly put the two and two together. Isaac Newton, 1948, Israel, whoa. You know.
Yeah.
I find that interesting. You know. But then again,
well,
I go to Vincent Price movies for the humor.
Well, like I said, I do believe that I'm a post-trib rapture type person. For those who are familiar with the terminology, so I don't believe the rapture will occur before the tribulation, but I do believe we'll be caught up to be with Christ in the air. So, but again, you know, you're speaking to at this point, you're speaking to Christians who do believe that, your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. Who may be caught up in prophecy. Well, how would you counsel them in terms of, you know, as someone who's maybe disagreeing with them, but Chris, you know, how would you do that?
I'd probably say that no one knows the day and hour, not even the Son, but only the Father. So don't look for it in the short term. And again, live life in furtherance of the kingdom of God on earth.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best advice. I mean, my view is for many, many years has been basically live like Christ is coming tonight and plan like he's coming in, you know, 20 to 50 or 100 years or whatever, how far you want to push it out. Mm-hmm. But, you know, live like he's here today and plan like he's going to be here in a long time. Well, we're about out of time, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank Dr. Tony Mitchell for joining us this week, and be sure to check out the Nergion Network for the discussion network. There's interesting posts going up almost any time. I'll actually have 3 more going up, I believe, sometime about the middle of October. So be sure to check out what's going on there. And then on Tuesdays and Thursday nights, more Google Hangouts with authors and other interesting topics going on. So I want to thank you for joining us, and I hope you will be with us next week. And this is Elgin Hushpeck, Chris Ayers, and Dr. Tony Mitchell for Global Christian Perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm out of here.
I'm still seeing the live button.